Welcome back to How to Double Your Church. Just think about that word one more time. How to double your church. Not to grow it a little bit, but to actually double it. How to double your business. And then we talked about something very personal. How do we double your life, your own productivity? And this is the last session, and I wanted to do something different. I wanted to be personal, just between me and you, and therefore there's no audience in this last session. You look at your workbook then to session number 8, and I want you really to get this. If you get this, you will be changed. It's not that you'll have to say, I wish I knew how to change. It's going to be, this truth from the Bible is right here, you know. It's not hard to get a hold of, it's hard to do because we've drifted so far. So take a look under the introduction to 2 Timothy chapter 4, 1 through 2 on your workbook. I charge you therefore, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at His appearing and His kingdom. Okay, now what's He going to charge us to do? Preach the Word. Now you know why. It's the key to it all. When they said to Jesus, why'd you come? I came to preach. Preach the Word. Be ready to preach. In season and out of season, meaning when you're in the mood for it and you're ready for it, and when you're not. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and with teaching. So under the introduction, I want you just to think about 4 questions. And why don't you just write your own answers in? And if you're not a pastor, then kind of estimate what you think your pastor does, just to get a handle on this. Why? To see if we've drifted very far. Number 1, how many times a week do you usually preach or teach? How many times? Number 2, if you teach or preach outside of the church, not in the church building, where? Where? This question here. Where do you preach? Where do you preach? Number 3, how many times a week do you preach on Sundays? And lastly, how many times did you preach last week, not including Sunday? What are those questions to do? To cause you to think about the 3 questions of who you're preaching to, where are you preaching, and how often are you preaching. So go to part number 1, the priority of preaching locations. In other words, where did Christ and the apostles actually, where did they go to preach? Look at the verse beneath that in your workbook. Acts 17:17 says, therefore he reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews and the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace. Now here's the word. In the marketplace, not in the church, in the marketplace where people work. He taught in the marketplace how often? Daily. What? Daily? He taught in the marketplace daily? You mean he taught where the people that didn't go to church worked and lived? And he taught them daily? Is that ever not a clue? So we have some summary points beneath it, and we'll get into this more as we get into it. Number 1, Christ and the apostles taught their ministry team everywhere. If you study what Jesus did, He had His disciples, His 3, His 12, His 120, and a bunch of people that followed, but He taught His kind of inner group all the time. Wherever He went, they were with Him, and He was teaching them. Number 2, Christ and the apostles taught in the marketplace, like we just read. Number 3, Christ and the apostles did teach, they taught in the temple and the synagogue. Those 2 words, the temple and the synagogue, in their culture would represent our church, Sunday morning church. They did preach there. Number 4, Christ and the apostles taught in believers' and unbelievers' homes. Number 5, Christ and the apostles often taught in the public open air, just out with the people. If you go back in church history, you find that the normative place to preach outside of the church was in the open air, where the people were. Have you ever done that? I've done that, just in the middle of New York City, on the corner. Number 6, Christ and the apostles taught on home and foreign mission trips. They actually organized mission trips, brought the people with them Different people preached and taught, but he actually planned mission trips to go preach. Number 7, Christ and the apostles taught in political settings. Oftentimes, political people would come and debate and argue and attack him, and he would start teaching right to them. And number 8, I want you to compare now to see about the drift for you. And number 8 says, compare Christ and the apostles' preaching priority to today's pastors and teachers. So look at the little chart beneath it. It's got 3 columns: the comparison, the percentage of preaching outside the church, the percentage of preaching inside the church. Got it? Look up here just for a minute. In other words, we're making this real clear. It's the priority of Christ's preaching. Where did he preach? Did he preach mostly in the church, which would be the synagogue and the temple? Or was it mostly in the marketplace, out there where people were? If you take a look at this, then, the first line across it is Christ and the apostles. Most biblical scholars say that he did outside of the church at least 80% of the time. 80. And the percentage of preaching inside was no more than 20%. Some of the scholars would go all the way down to 5 or 10% inside the church. Now flip that over and go back to my chart of drift. If you then believe what Jesus said, a disciple is like his master in all ways, and then you study Christ's model and say, I'm his disciple, I'm going to follow him in this way, I'm going to make sure that where I preached is like what he did, and he spent 80% of his time preaching to the people outside of the church and 20% in the church. Well, if you flip it over and you ask pastors, as I have, it's exactly the opposite. It's like this. The average pastor actually spends between 0 and 20% at the most preaching outside the church. Many, it's 0. I never preach in the marketplace. I never go to the hospitals. I never preach in a prison. I preach to my church, as if that's what you're supposed to do with all of your time. Preach on Sunday. So the third line there is, evaluate yourself. Where are you? How far is the drift? Okay. How you doing out there? You thinking with me? It's a lot to chew on. That would mean you'd have to change quite a few things if you got it. If I'm teaching the Bible well to you right this minute, it means you realize, yeah, that is what Christ and the apostles did, and I'm not doing that, and that is how Christ built his church. The greatest church planter in the church age is the Apostle Paul. How did he start churches? He preached and he taught, and then he kept doing it, and he traveled all over the world doing the same thing. So what do you think about changing? So let's go to part number 2, the priority of preaching frequency. How often did Christ and the apostles preach? This has to do with numbers. I wish that the New Testament told us numbers. It doesn't. So we have to kind of read everything and surmise, their best estimate, what the answer to that question really is. I put some verses down. Why don't you look at the top one? And halfway down, the third line, it says, with many tears, I'm in Acts chapter 20, with many tears which happened to me by the plotting of the Jews, how I kept back nothing that was helpful, here it is, but proclaimed it to you and taught you publicly from house to house. Next passage, Luke chapter 4. Jesus said, I must preach the kingdom of God to the other cities, plural, also because for this purpose I have been sent. Jesus, why were you sent? To preach the truth. Why? The truth sets people free. It's the truth that transforms. Third passage, Luke chapter 8, verse 1. Again, what are we trying to think about? We're trying to think about frequency. How often? How often? How many times? Luke chapter 8. Now it came to pass afterward that Jesus went through every city and village, preaching the glad tidings of the kingdom, and the 12 were with him. Guess what they were doing? They were preaching and teaching too, as you know in the New Testament. Look at chapter 2 of Mark. And again, he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. And look at the end of that verse, and he preached the word to them. Did Jesus preach in home Bible studies? Yes, a lot. You go back and study how many times Christ was invited to a home. He even invited himself to homes. And when he got there and got in discussion, he began to teach. How many times did you teach last week in somebody's home? Especially if they were not Christians and didn't attend church. Mark chapter 2, and he went out again by the sea, and all the multitude came to him, and he taught them. What are you seeing in these verses? These are just a few of them. John chapter 8, verse 2, now early in the morning, he came again into the temple, in a sense, the church, and all the people came to him, and he sat down like I am right now, and he taught them. And the last one, take a look at the last half of that in Matthew chapter 10, third line. And as you go, said Jesus, preach. Saying this to his followers, his disciples, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now it came to pass when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples that he departed from there, and what did he go do? It's amazing. He departed from there to do what? To teach and to preach in their cities. But what are you picking up? You could say to yourself, yeah, but Jesus wasn't a pastor. That's right. That's right. But he is showing you his priorities of frequency. When you read through church history, the past 2,000 years, and you read some of the pastors that changed their countries the most, oh man, they would preach 10, 20, 30 times a week. There's one pastor that preached 40,000 sermons. Sometimes he'd preach 3 sermons in a day to different audiences. What have we done? We're preaching one to the same people. We're preaching, why doesn't God grow our church when the people we're preaching are already in our church? How are you going to grow your church when they're already here? You have to go to the lost, where Jesus Christ taught. So take a look at your workbook. We have kind of a summary for you. And number 1 says study the number of times, so we're in frequency, how often, Christ and the apostles preached and taught. And I have 7 underneath there. And if you look across the top, it's never, he never did this, he rarely did this. He occasionally did this. This is Christ, Paul, and the apostles, often, frequently, and daily. And this is obviously an estimate. It's my estimate, and perhaps you may disagree a little bit. I can't defend this. It's just what it appears to me after reading the Bible so many times. Number 1, Jesus taught their ministry team, his close followers, occurred almost all the time. It's daily, so mark the word daily in your workbook. Far right. Number 2, taught in the temple and the synagogue. It occurred very frequently. That's under the box frequently in your workbook. Number 3, taught in the marketplace. Answer, occurred frequently. It's under the frequently box. Number 6, taught in various homes. It occurred often in that category. Number 5, taught in the open air. It occurred often. He taught on mission trips. That was occasionally. If you just go through the Gospels and you go through the book of Acts and you count how many times they went out on a mission trip, it'd shock you. So what do? We stay home. We never group a bunch of our people in our church or our leaders of our church and let's say, let's go in 6 months on a mission trip. Let's go over here and let's plant a church in a week. And number 7, taught in political settings. It happened occasionally. So I've summarized some of this in point number 2. Jesus Christ and the apostles kept preaching and teaching their highest priority. Boy, hold on to that word. What's the most important thing you do? That's the most important thing you do. Number 3, Jesus Christ and the apostles preached more than any other ministry including healing. Number 4, Jesus Christ and the apostles often taught numerous times daily. Sometimes all day, sometimes into the late at night. Number 5, Jesus Christ and the apostles taught most frequently. Now this is an important one. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. Who did Jesus Christ talk to the most? He taught those in ministry training. Boy, have we drifted away from this. Jesus handpicked some of the people and said, I'm going to build into you. I'm taking you where I go minister. I'm going to train you, then put you out in 2x2s. You go do it, then you do it by yourself. Why? That's how things explode. It's when you're only doing all the stuff, you're not going to grow exponentially. Why? You're not following Christ's method. Method number 1, get 12 people around you or 10 people around you and train them and bring them with you and let them go do it. Then you'll have 11 of you working instead of just number 1. Number 6, Jesus Christ and the apostles taught outside more than inside the synagogue. The synagogue. And number 7, boy, I tell you, I wish I had an hour on this because I'm going to talk about this in another series. Jesus Christ and the apostles ensured, they made sure of what? Because preaching and teaching is the key. Are there all things that kind of pull away at a pastor and distract him from that? Oh, yes. So what did they do? Did they let drifting take place? Did they let secondary priorities pull them away? Well, let's put down 7. Jesus Christ and the apostles ensured preaching was not hindered by administration. By administration. I just want to read these verses to you in your workbook, Acts chapter 6. Look how they thought about this. Then the 12 apostles summoned the multitude of the disciples and said, it is not desirable that we should leave, that's drifting, we should leave the Word of God and serve tables, do administration for the widows. But instead of doing that, we will give ourselves, listen to these words, continually. What? Yeah, we'll give ourselves continually to prayer and the ministry of the Word. What's the ministry of the Word? It's teaching and preaching. Tell me again what you said. We'll give ourselves continually. Why? This is what Christ wants the most. What's the result? Look at the verse. Then the Word of God spread and the number of disciples multiplied greatly. Why? That's how Christ built the church, is building the church, and will build the church. So, number 8. Go back to a little bit of self-examination. Compare Christ and the apostles' preaching and their frequency to today's pastors and churches. And this has to do, if you see the 3 boxes, left box is how often do we preach, how often do we teach. Middle box, the number of times outside the church. This isn't where, this is how often. And on the right-hand side, the number of times inside the church. Christ and the apostles, again, this is an estimate, is anywhere between 10 and 30 times outside the church in an average week. And inside the church and synagogue, 1 to 3 times. Pastors in churches today, I've asked a lot of pastors around this question, actually around the world, I've asked these questions. How many times do you preach outside of your church? The answer is consistently 0, 1, maybe 2. Compare that to Jesus. Do you feel the drift is huge? And then you ask the questions, how many times do you preach inside of a church? It's anywhere from 1 to 3. Maybe I can just draw this on the flip chart for a minute and just help you get the perspective. Here's Jesus. Here's his week. What's he doing? He's preaching, he's preaching, he's preaching, he's teaching in homes. I don't know. He does more than that in a week. Well, okay, what do? Well, we come along and we preach Sunday morning. What do we do all this other time? Well, we could give all kind of good reasons. They just don't fit with the New Testament very well. We will give ourselves, what's that word? Continually. What did we do all here? Here's what we did. We did not preach. That's what we did right here. Just imagine if a pastor says, wait, I am going to do what Jesus did. I'm changing things. I'm going to delegate, like the New Testament teaches, to other people in the church to do all this stuff. Because we're not going to leave the number one method that Christ wants done by the shepherds. Minister to the people in the church? Yes. Train them for all this? Yes. We'll get to that in another course. But what do we have to do? This is what we have to do. Preach Christ stuff for life change. Well, I told you at the beginning it wasn't going to be easy. How do you feel about repenting? Let's say you're preaching twice a week to the church and maybe once or twice a month outside of the church. Stop. Stop. Fix it. Why? Because you can. You're in charge of your life. And as Jesus taught in the parable of the minas, you do business till I come. Do you know how you become a 10 mina pastor? You do what Jesus did. If you lived your life like this, and you had Bible studies all kinds of places, in your community, in the homes, in the prison, in the schools, how could your church not grow? Okay. Last thing, part number 3, as we wrap up, it is the question of who did Christ and the apostles preach to? Who was the focus of the preaching of Christ and the apostles? Number 1, the priority focus number 1 was preach to the lost. Preach to the lost, the people who are not yet converted to Christ. Point number 2, train through preaching other preachers. When you said, how did you, Jesus, do it? He's so clear. I picked out 10 faithful men, and I built into them until when I was done, after a few years, they changed the world. What do? We get threatened if somebody else in the church starts to learn to preach. We're afraid that person's going to take some people out of our church. Oh, man. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What? Yeah, we misunderstand this whole thing. You see, from Christ's point of view, there's one church. It's His. It's not a Methodist or a Baptist or a Roman Catholic. It's His. It's my church. What's it called? It's the My Church denomination. And when believers move from one location to another location, and you said to Jesus, my attendance went down, and Jesus would say, well, mine didn't. They went from here to here. And if you understood, your point isn't how many people are in your church, it's how many people left your church and went to other churches and started other churches, and how many of the people like Jesus that you trained and said, go and take, here, if you live over there, go with them. Because God doesn't view this as a splitting of a church. He views it as a multiplying of a church. And the Bible's very clear in Corinthians that if you're the pastor and these people were trained by you and the people left and they went and planted other churches, believe it or not, all those people are added to your account personally. So change your mind and follow what Jesus did. Find your 10 or 12 people and start training them and go on mission trips and say, let's plant a couple churches this year. Do you have the courage to follow in the footsteps of Jesus? Do you have enough courage to overcome your fear of what other people may say? Do you have the courage to change your priorities and get out of the stuff that other people should be doing so that you can give yourself continually? Do you have the heart to make sure that never again you will preach your own stuff? Will you break free so that the founder of the church himself stands up on his throne and says to the angelic host, now that church right there, let's really explode that church. They're finally doing it my way. And your church will grow so fast, you won't know what to do it. Because when Christ makes it grow, it grows. It grows. He says, I'm the one who grows the church. He is waiting for you to let him get out of his throne like he did when Stephen was being stoned. He stood up from his throne. It was such a precious moment to Christ. He stood up. He wants to stand up and name you. And I do too. If I never ever get to speak to you again, may today be one of those turning points of your life that will change eternity. On behalf of the team, Teach Every Nation, God bless you. Until next time.